Well, it's just bizarre because snipers have been using the literal curve of the earth to plan where bullets go. That's
if
how
they
you
want it that
plot
precise.
out.
Oh, yeah,
When you have to. When you shoot at a mile, you know, when you're shooting like well out over 1,000 yards, those factors.
All right, one of the things that pops up in every one of our long-range rifle classes is Coriolis effect and spin drift, okay? It's in every ballistic program. It's out there. It's in some manuals. And it's theory, okay? Here's where I'm coming from. I was on several long-range rifle and sniping type web pages where there's interaction between the folks that are on them. And a question came up from a kid that was a brand new Army sniper. He was getting ready to go to sniper school and he was worried about how he was going to pass this course. So of course he put it out there to any Army snipers, hey, what am I going to get to go through? What do I need to work on? And one of the answers he got really pissed me off. It was, you need to worry about Coriolis and spin drift more than anything else. Now, given the plethora of other information, mathematical equations on range estimation, sight alignment, sight picture, breathing, trigger control, follow through, prepping for the next shot, all these things result in quality accuracy downrange if you do them properly. Coriolis and spin drift are theory, okay? Whether you want to agree to this or not, it's somebody's mathematical theory.
You have to when you shoot at a mile.
So as the bullet leaves the barrel of the gun, the earth is still rotating, and the bullet is not rotating with the earth. So the earth will actually rotate out from underneath of the bullet while it is in flight.
Whether you want to agree to this or not, it's somebody's mathematical theory.
We are all moving with the earth at 800 miles an hour.
So as the bullet leaves the barrel of the gun, the earth is still rotating, and the bullet is not rotating with the earth.
We are all moving with the earth.
You have to when you shoot at a mile.
You apply the fundamentals of marksmanship properly, crosshairs where they need to be, do the right dope on the gun, fire the shot effectively, you're going to get a good hit on target. We're back to the errors involved at the ranges again. We'll use 500. Doesn't matter if you are 1.5 inches left or right of your aim point, in this case at 500 yards. Absolutely not. Still a killing shot. At 1,000 yards, 10 inches may have an effect, but I'm back to the wind again. Is it not you calling a bad wind call, or is it spin drift? We don't know. Now, the problem with the standard theory and Rod's theory, or Storm Mountain's theory, is we can't test either side of the coin. We basically need a 1,000 yard indoor range with 100% no wind conditions inside that to prove this fact, or theory I should say. It's not available to my knowledge. I know of no indoor range with no wind conditions in the country or the world, and I've shot on a bunch of ranges. For that matter, I say apply the fundamentals of marksmanship, dial in your wind properly, which is the big issue, shoot your shot, and adjust off of that. Thanks very much. Remember to subscribe to the YouTube channel. Check us out at stormmountain.com or smtc.us. We look forward to seeing you long gun courses in the future. Take care.
So the earth will actually rotate out from underneath of the bullet while it is in flight.
I'm not going to talk about how this guy did the Red Bull jump and somehow the earth didn't rotate out from under him. I'm going to talk about something that I know about. I was in the military, in a Ranger battalion, in a long-range reconnaissance surveillance unit. Went to various schools, and I've done my share of shooting a lot of different weapons. And I went to a lot of different schools explaining target acquisition. Even after my military service, I continue to be a firearm enthusiast, and I reload my own ammunition, which means I have a very good understanding of internal ballistics. And also, when it comes to in the field, I can use my reticles and calculate yardage and calculate compensation and compensate for the wind quite well. I know how to use a reticle to determine yardage and use that to hit a target in high wind. And at 500 yards, I can yield a target like this pretty consistently. But here's a drill I want to do to obviate the problem with what they teach about the Coriolis effect. I picked Singapore because it's on the equator. And we know that on the equator, the Earth is spinning at about 1,000 miles an hour. There are a few equatorial cities, but this is a good one because it's also on the water. There happens to be a lighthouse in Singapore also, which makes an excellent stationary target. This is called the Marina Lighthouse in Singapore, within 1 degree of the equator. So let's bring in the shooter who's going to hit this target. Meet Mr. New Jersey. This is one of the biggest battleships ever made. It has a 16-inch gun that can reach 25 miles. I've seen specs that say up to 28 miles, depending on the ammunition, but here's a quick snip of some proof. They're saying that bullet actually goes almost 2,700 feet per second, and here they claim 24 miles. I've seen different ones. The weight of that bullet is a ton. Here's a picture of an old decommissioned barrel with a mock projectile to give you an idea of the size of this gun, because this is what we're going to hypothetically set up as a scenario to hit that lighthouse. Here's one of the projectiles in the magazine tube where it would feed up to the gun, and once it gets up there, they pack hundreds of pounds of powder behind that bullet. It's one of the more impressive guns anyone could ever see fired. When they pull the trigger, the explosion is so enormous that it sounds like it's the end of the world. When you see them fire them off from the air, you can see the decompression of that barrel gas make a shockwave across the water the size of a football field. So you aim at your lighthouse 25 miles away, you pull the trigger, boom, it should fall to the ground, right? Well, not exactly. We got a couple problems with this, and let's use math. 25-mile target from the New Jersey has a flight time of 90 seconds. So you're aiming 90 degrees from the ship straight to the equator to hit that lighthouse, and it takes 90 seconds for the bullet to get there. Problem is, in 90 seconds at the equator, the Earth moves 25 miles. So it takes 90 seconds for the bullet to get from the ship to the lighthouse, but in that 90 seconds, the lighthouse moves 25 miles. So you're going to miss it by 25 miles. Now, those are nice numbers to work with because it sets up a triangle. And you can do a little math to go, well, could I actually lead the target and compensate for the Earth spinning underneath of it like they say you have to? Well, how far is it? A squared plus B squared equals C squared, which will give you the distance of the hypotenuse you would have to use to lead the target at a 45-degree angle. And you'll find that you couldn't hit that target because it ends up being a 33-mile hypotenuse. So you're going to shoot a lighthouse. The ship and the lighthouse move. Even if you tried to lead the target, you're going to fall 8 miles short because the range of the gun is only 25 miles. Think about that, people. I don't think that this ship misses targets. I don't think it's 25 miles off when it shoots at a target 25 miles away. You have to use your brain and just think about some of these things that obviate that they're full of crap. They show you Foucault pendulums and say everything moves independently underneath of an object, but then they tell you this guy floated around for hours above the earth and jumped in the same place he took off from. You have to analyze and think on your own, and you just tell me if this makes sense to you, because it makes a lot of sense to me. Hope you have a great day.
No. No. The one on the left has to be an illusion. But I think we can shoot the boat on the right. The curvature chart says it's okay.
Yep, there's a kitty hawk.
Certainly not that one. That's a refracted image of a boat that's hidden below 50 feet of water. Stupid flat earthers actually think that's a boat there.
We're not gonna be able to see the
No,
kitty hawk.
same with that one. Don't shoot, that's a mirage.
Destroyer, and then
Ooh, that's a
another
tough one.
works. That's a
Maybe
Japanese
half
guy right
refraction,
there,
half
I
real.
think.
So aim for the top half of the
It's
boat.
okay. It's just doing that.
Not that one, that's refraction. There's no boat there. You're aiming at a wall of
We
water.
should see Seawolf coming up pretty soon, right?
Yes, yes, finally, the curvature chart says that one is okay to shoot.
Just keep cycling through.
Absolutely not. It's actually hidden behind something like 40 feet of
Yeah,
water.
there's a scope.
Damn, this is hard.
Adjusting. Nope.
Why in the
Yeah,
hell did
I'm
we
two
even
scopes
install
nothing
a
at
periscope? It's not like it's useful for any boat beyond a few miles.
So let me think. A mile, I have to ask, how much curvature of the Earth do you get after a mile? It's an
We also
interesting
get drop.
question.
You get drop and curvature.
That'd be gravity drop.
Yes.
And then curve. Yeah. So both of those.
Yeah. Well, there's a good. Well, it's here's the thing.
Brian's the master gunner.
Yes, Brian. Glad to meet you, sir.
Yes.
Hey, Brian.
Hello.
So, Brian, how long did you guys train to account for the Coriolis effect when you were learning to shoot?
Never.
Never? That means never. Why not, Brian? If the Earth's rotating, then wouldn't you have to take that into account? Wouldn't that affect, or what were you shooting?
120 and below.
Okay, so what's the next distance on those things?
Pretty far.
Would you say farther than your standard or average rifle bullet?
Oh yeah, several miles.
Okay, so see, this doesn't make sense. We get all these documents about we have to take the Coriolis effect into account for ballistic missiles and ballistics. But none of our actual field manuals, which are very hard to get a hold of, the actual training manuals, ever mention this, and none of the soldiers or people we talked to ever
They
mention
do. Wait,
this.
I got to correct you on that. There is a Coriolis effect supposedly in the training manuals, and I've seen them. Just never used them. Never had to use them.
So you actually seen them in a real manual, not made for
Yes.
public release, not labeled top secret, then made.
It's called a firing table. It's called a firing table. Yeah. A firing
Okay.
table. There is supposedly in there, but we never used it ever.
Were you told not to use it?
No. Just never.
Isn't that because it doesn't? You don't have to start accounting for it until they say like over 1,000 yards or whatever, right?
No, I mean no. I shoot a lot further. I shoot further than that.
Or not?
It's kind of like if you ask a geodetic surveyor when does he use the math for the curvature, they know it, but they've never used it. It's one of those things they're taught, but they've never actually used it.
So this
You know what I'm saying?
does this table take into account for different places? Like maybe if you're stationed, in South Australia, the spin rate of the Earth's far different than, say, if you're stationed in Texas.
It does and it doesn't. See, the problem I've had with it is it takes in latitude of where you are in longitude, but it doesn't take in effect which way you're firing, which would technically you'd have to know which direction you're firing, no matter which way you are, because east and west would be exact opposites reaction.
Right. So then that's actually in manuals.
There is a calculation in manuals that you can find, but ironically, it's not used. Here's my quick question, real quick. What is this hangout? What am I in? What did you all draw me in?
I don't know. I think it was Candy's idea.
Well, it's
But
fine. I'm just
glad you answered that. Well, you answered a great question.
This is the roast of Brian Burton. Didn't you hear?
Yeah, he's here.
Oh, I don't give a shit. You roast me all you want. I don't care. I'm just curious. Here's the thing, okay? There is calculations in the manuals and all that. However, it's just like my tanks. In the tanks, they have computers that calculate all this shit, supposedly. We got gyros and everything else, okay? However, when, for lack of better words, I don't know if we're live or not, when shit hits the fan, I have manual ways of doing things, and nowhere do I put in where I am on the planet, as they call it, or which direction, or Coriolis effect, or anything else. Nowhere do I ever do that in manual calculation. There is a formula to do it, but never had to do it, and I've never missed, so I'm not too worried about it. So no, I do not. Those stories of snipers taking effect and all that never happen. And I've known snipers, and they've never done it either.
So these are your YouTube Gunworks type snipers that shoot tin cans out in the backyard.
Okay, I'm talking about military grade snipers that actually shoot.
So the military grade snipers do not take into account the Coriolis effect.
I've never met one to actually do it.
I was talking to a Marine on Saturday at the meetup with Jaron in Palmdale, and he's an instructor, and he's still not for the military anymore, but just private.
Right.
And we were talking about like the Coriolis and the curve of the earth and spin of the earth and all that, and he was just, yeah, it's a bunch of crap.
It is. It's a bunch of crap.
So then, if that is in your manual, Brian, then do they explain in the manual how an aircraft would be able to land again if they have given you calculations for the Coriolis effect and ballistic firing?
No, see, here's the funny thing. They don't really explain. So when I calculate where, excuse the animals, when I calculate where a round goes, they give us this formula, and there is a spot to put, quote, your latitude, longitude, but when you do the math and all that, it's irrelevant. It's almost doesn't matter. It doesn't matter.
There was no difference. So the natural interpretation, and even Einstein admits this, Mach admits this, Born admits this, the natural interpretation is that the Earth isn't moving. So how do we get out of that? Well, you invent special relativity.
It's a dummy equation.
Called the Lorentz transform, and it's probably the most famous equation used in physics today.
It's a dummy equation.
Does anyone expressly admit that, hey, we had to come up with this contraction effect because otherwise we're stuck with a motionless
Yes,
Earth?
the very guy who invented it.
They don't tell you that. They just, this is what you do, and this is what we do, and we do go through the stuff. But you never take effect of where you are on the, I'm going to have to use global terms, sorry, where you are on the planet and which direction you're facing and how high up you are, and the calculations aren't there. It's almost a dummy equation in there. You don't need it. You really don't. I've never had to use it and never had a problem.
Okay. Well, that is interesting, Brian. I appreciate you sharing that with us. You know, and that's my thing. If those calculations were needed, then my thing is airplanes would also be affected. And
exactly. Airplanes would need it. Helicopter, balloons, all kinds of things.
And there's no way a helicopter, airplane, or balloon is going to land on something that can spin much faster than what it's rated to fly.
And also, you got to figure too, think about a guy on the ground. There is no way he can calculate or have the instrumentation, not only to figure out where he is exactly, but which direction he's firing, and to do the calculation for how fast it's turning. And that's a heck of a math problem. Maybe a computer could do it, but a guy on the ground, nah.
So have you been in combat situations before?
Yes.
And so when you're in combat situations, isn't reaction time important?
Yeah, if you don't react, you die. It's pretty simple.
Okay, so you probably wouldn't have the 10 minutes or so to sit there and figure all that out, would you?
No. No, well, our manual, the way I fire my tank manually and all that, no, we set everything up prior for a manual shooting. But like I said, once I go to manual, there's no where I am on the planet. There is no which direction I'm firing. Is it going north, east, west for the spin or anything? It's not there. None of it's there.
And you've never had issues, no matter where you're at, not calculating the Coriolis effect?
Never.
And one of the answers he got really pissed me off. It was, you need to worry about Coriolis and spindrift more than anything else. Now, given the plethora of other information, mathematical equations on range estimation, sight alignment, sight picture, breathing, trigger control, follow through, prepping for the next shot, all these things result in quality accuracy downrange if you do them properly. Coriolis and spindrift are theory. Okay, whether you want to agree to this or not, it's somebody's mathematical theory.
That's about 1 hour. And the rotor axis was pointing and is pointing directly at our 5 degrees. The legs of the gimbal that's attached to the clock, moving clock, tabletop platform thing, has moved round from 5 degrees, or I think it may have been 10 degrees, I'll have to go back and have a look, to the 20 and 25 degrees, which would correlate with the eternity Earth being 15 degrees per hour, or 360 degrees in 24 hours. So I'm happy with this. I'm not sure whether to leave it another hour or not. I'll just set it up more rigidly, but for all intents and purposes it seems to be resisting the friction in the bearing. This is an unoiled, non-ball bearinged pivot on the bottom of the gyro. I think it's copper maybe, or brass. Looks like brass. I'm talking quite slowly because any movement in here might rock it, and I don't want to jog it or muck it up. I'm going to leave it for another hour, see how it gets on. So there we've got a record. So we've got the gyro pointing at 5 degrees. And the gimbal leg pointing at, I'm going to say 20 degrees. 20, it's different when you look at it to when you look at camera. Okay, let's give it 22 degrees. And that was at 8 p.m. Later. Alright then, back again. So we have the gimbal leg is pointing at 35. And the gyroscope is dead set on 5 degrees. No change. And so this is where Everyone thinks it could be faked a million ways, and of course it could. So this is where people say that this is rigid, it's holding it in place. Well, it's not. It's when they say it's stuck. So we move it this way, and we move it that way to show it's not stuck. And we know. Nope. Still on it, isn't it? And that shows it's not stuck to that. Following on, and this spins through these things. This is the bearing. It was accused of holding this gyroscope steady, so as not to show the movement of the Earth. However, I think what we've shown here is that there's nothing wrong with this gyroscope setup or bearing. Alright, I'll leave it there. Alright then, so experiment 3 effectively. We have this rather crude contraption. It's consisting of the gyroscope, the motor, and onboard attached batteries. That's basically the setup, and it weighs less than the motor with the counterweight that was attached to the wall socket, so it should in theory be more sensitive than the original 6-hour experiment. So we shall see how we get on there. I don't suspect the batteries are going to last much longer than an hour, but within an hour we should see 15 degrees of turn. So I think we'll kick that off and see how it gets on. But as you can see, the wire is there, there's no wires attached, it's freely flowing, and yeah, see how it gets on. Right, so I'll get the batteries going and line it up and leave it for as long as it'll go. there. Okay. Clock is on 29 minutes past, 30 minutes past. I can see the camera doing some funky things with autofocus, which is why it looks like it's shifting left and right. But so that's 30 minutes working now. Okay, that's been over an hour. As you can see, there's no movement. I'm not going to carry on, as I think we all know where this is going. So, wires or not, bearing friction or not, the Earth is not spinning. Got the setup. Got it running. It's been running now for nearly half an hour. 26 minutes. I'm really not seeing any movement at all. At this point, it should have precessed 7.5 degrees. As you can see, it's not precessed at all. So just demonstrate that this spins, turns with the page when it's not spun up, when the gyro is not spun up. So spin it up and then I'll show you how it keeps its position. So that's just spinning up there now, you might be able to hear it. Now, even at this low speed, the gyroscope will hold its position. See that? Okay, so what we want to do, line it up exactly okay. Okay, so that's 6 hours, no movement whatsoever, As the video showing, no one's tampered with it, touched it, gone anywhere near it. So what I'm going to do now is move the protractor underneath it and simulating the movement of the Earth, just showing you that it's not fixed or glued or whatever other craziness you think I might be pulling. So, can you witness this?
Yeah, I'm with you. I'm with you.
Okay. So there you see, if anything below it was moving, it would maintain its position with rigidity in space. And we've started it off there for 6 hours and we have no movement whatsoever.
Here it is, gyroscopes. Prove unequivocally, beyond any doubt whatsoever, two things actually. One, that there is no curvature of the Earth, and two, that there is no motion to the Earth. Now I'm all ready for all of the backlash and all the stuff like that. And in fact, one of the first people I'm going to go on is there is this wonderful video done in total ignorance by Lord Stephen Christ, who comes on and he says, well, got news for you guys. Gyroscopes have this thing called Schuler tuning on them. And it is because of the Schuler tuning that it proves beyond any doubt whatsoever that the Earth is, of course, concave. That would be his take on it. Not only does it not prove that it's not concave, it also proves that it's not convex either. Because Stephen Christ, you know, for being the imaginative lord that he is, obviously has never bothered to read any further about what Schuler tuning actually is and how it is actually applied. I'm going to explain that and elaborate a little bit on this for you guys so that we can kind of dispel the Schuler tuning myth. Now, I did cover this 2 or 3 weeks ago already. Granted, I had never heard of it before. Even being a pilot for 35 years, I had never heard of it before. Even working in radio shops, right along people that had airframe and power plant licenses that were working on avionics and aircraft radio, still never had come across it. Why? Because it's basically a fantasy. Here's the deal with Schuler tuning. Schuler tuning describes a procedure to affect an inertial navigation system to compensate for a theoretical curvature of the Earth. Of all the navigation systems I have seen or asked others about that work in the industry, this modification seems to be conspicuously not used. Now, let's look at what Wiki says about Schuler tuning. So it says Schuler tuning is a modification to the electronic control system used in inertial navigation systems. Now this is important right here, and we'll address this in a second. That accounts for the curvature of the Earth. An inertial navigation system used in submarines, ships, aircraft, and other vehicles to keep track of position determines directions with respect to 3 axes pointing northeast and down. To detect a vehicle's orientation, the system contains an inertial platform mounted on gimbals with gyroscopes to keep it pointing in a fixed orientation in space. However, the directions northeast and down change as the vehicle moves on the curved surface of the Earth. Schuler tuning describes the modifications necessary to an inertial navigation system to keep the inertial platform always pointing northeast, south, down, yada, yada, yada. Okay, well, first of all, we have to look and say, okay, well, what's the inertial navigation system? So we look at that. So an INS is a navigation aid that uses a computer, first and foremost, and that is also huge. Motion sensors, accelerometers, and rotation sensors, gyroscopes, to continuously calculate via dead reckoning the position, orientation, and velocity of a moving object without the need for external references. Okay, so let me break this down and tell you what this is actually saying. So, and before I do that, let's jump over here to the other thing that it talked about, inertial platform, which is basically a gyroscopic platform or a stabilized platform using gyroscopes to maintain a platform in a fixed orientation in space, blah, 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 blah. Okay, but let's go back to this. So what they're talking about here is Schuler tuning is a system that describes modification to an inertial navigation system, which, first of all, an inertial navigation system, as we have already described, requires the use of a computer. Well, that, first of all, should raise a lot of red flags to anybody that was a pilot before 25 years ago, which would be me, and many, many other people on the Earth. And the reason being is because we were not using computers in our aircraft at that time or any time since the Wright brothers to compensate for the curvature of the Earth. It's utterly nonsense. So what it's doing, what they're saying is that this modification brought about by Schuler tuning, which is using a computer to affect a navigation system. Now, first of all, let me tell you what the navigation system is that they're describing. These navigation systems are not in use in most aircraft today. They are in use in a large amount of the airliners, but as far as to the total percentage of all aircraft on Earth, not even a drop in the bucket. So what this is saying is that the inertial navigation system, which would be a complete autopiloting system, which would allow you to take off, fly your route, do your landing, all that stuff, all by computer control automatically. It is the Schuler tuning that is a procedure that describes how to modify an already existing internal navigation system to compensate for the curvature of the Earth, whether it be from GPS data, which, by the way, is not existent for that particular function, or some other methodology, which there is another methodology, and I'll talk about that in a little bit. But the bottom line is it's talking about modifying an existing navigation system that would be of the high order of technology anyway that never even existed before 25, 30 years ago. So even if it were true, which it isn't, but even if it were true that it were modifying the orientation of the gyros to keep consistent so that the gyroscope is at a constant 90-degree angle perpendicular to the center point of the Earth, which would be directly below it, there is no way to necessarily do this. And I can tell you that all navigation equipment that most airplanes use, which is a gyroscope for your artificial horizon, for your turn and slip indicator, for your rate of climb, all of those are based on straight-up gyroscopes with absolutely no modification to them to change any orientation to the gyro itself to compensate for gravity or for the curvature of the Earth. Because the whole idea is to keep the gyroscope plane at a perfect 90-degree angle to the spot that's directly below you that goes all the way to the center of the Earth. So first of all, Schuler tuning is not even used in the majority of these systems. Now, another thing that they will talk about is there's another type of gyro that is fairly new, not hugely new, but that uses, instead of electric motors to power up the flywheel on the gyroscope, it uses vanes and air pressure. So another model that came up, and I was discussing this with Curious Life of a Flat Earther, that he caught a lot of rebuttal on, was these vanes that are supposedly in the bottom. Not supposedly, they actually are there, I will admit that, at the bottom of the gyroscopic structure that take the air that is blown across the vanes that spin the gyro, and according to gravity or the orientation of the plane, it will open one of 4 air gates to be able to discharge the air that is spinning up the gyro. Well, that's all great. Now, first of all, like I said, this is something that's relatively new. Before that, they simply used electric motors to spin up the gyros. However, there are magnetic fields and other things that can cause problems with that, even though they work well for the most part. This air drive is supposedly a better system. So great. But what they're saying then is that if you modify the aircraft, its trajectory or its angle, that what will happen is that the gyro will stay rigid in space, because that's what gyros do. They stay rigid in space no matter what the orientation of the plane is around it. But they're saying that when you go into like a 60-degree turn, for example, the gyroscope is going to stay rigid in space, but because the air vane that is discharging the air that is spinning up the gyro is kind of at the sump of the gyroscopic mechanism, that it will open one of 4 corresponding gates, one for each direction, northeast, southwest, and it will kind of force the line of gravity so that the gyroscope goes back to a perfect 90-degree perpendicular line to an imaginary line that goes down to the center of the Earth. Well, first of all, that's silly, because if you could do that simply by blowing air across some sort of a gate, you've got to take into consideration a million other factors, like what is the resistance of that gate to the air? In other words, what if it's sticky? How much air is actually going across it? You have surface contacts. You have a million things that have to be taken into consideration. But as far as it making any type of precision adjustment, that's simply impossible. What it actually does, what these air gates actually do, is they act as a dampening system. There are 2 mechanisms in a gyro that prevents it from spinning around in circles, and that is, if you're in an aerobatics plane and you do a roll or a loop or something like that, obviously the cage would be rotating all the way around the gyroscope, and it would cause everything to kind of run amok. But what they do is they put limits in on the gimbals that hold the gyroscope, so that once you go past 60 or 70 degrees, something like that, or maybe even more, there's a mechanical lock there that prevents it from going any further. Now, what the air pressure does going through those relief gates at the bottom, those discharge gates, is it acts more of a dampening mechanism so that you don't have such a wildly gyrating artificial horizon when you've come out of some sort of a high-speed maneuver that requires a lot of banking or hard turning or something like that. So the bottom line is that neither the air vanes at the bottom of the air-driven gyroscopes used to exist in the past. They were all motor-driven. And secondly, the computers to drive inertial navigation systems are only something that in the past few decades that have come about to even be able to allow an airplane to be computer-controlled. And so what happened to the 60 or 70 years before that when pilots were flying international flights, yada, yada, yada? In other words, the whole idea of the Schuler tuning of a navigation system that hasn't existed except for the last few decades is utter bullshit. So what gyroscopes really do is, their claim to fame is they have a rigidity in space. Now, you can buy a gyroscope. People have used gyroscopes for years. They're toys. They also make extremely high-end gyroscopes that are precision machined that will run for a long, long time, 20, 30 minutes, on a spin. They also have them now where you can use little electric motors externally to spin them up to around 8,000 RPM. Well, this is something that was never done, never able to be done, back in the days of antiquity when, for example, Foucault did his gyroscopic experiments. And Foucault is kind of credited for all of this, by the way. Not only was his pendulum bullshit, but he also lied about his results on gyroscopes. I guess where I'm going with this is there's a Navy video, and I've got it here, and I will actually also post this. Okay, so here's the Navy aviation training film. And what they say in this makes perfect logical sense for any gyro. And they say that because gyros maintain a rigidity in space, that you can change the orientation of the gimbals all around them that are attached to it, but the gyro will stay right there. So Foucault allegedly did an experiment where he and his cheesy 200-year-old gyro, supposedly, he was able to spin it up and actually see precession in the gyro, which would have indicated and proved motion, angular motion most specifically, brought about by the rotation of the Earth. Well, that's all fine and dandy, except that everybody that has performed this experiment since he's done it, and with far better equipment, has failed to get any results that even remotely come close to what Foucault claimed that he had. A good example, Rob Durham bought an extremely high precision gyroscope, did the precession test. Guess what? He let it run for, quite a while, and he had calculated the precession based on his latitude, and of course the gyroscope did not move at all. There is another guy, Yeoman P, that here's his video, where he let it run for 6 hours, and it detected absolutely zero motion. Well, a lot of people came back and their debunks was, well, the gyroscope simply was not sensitive enough to measure this movement of the Earth, which is, of course, ludicrous, because if Foucault could do it several hundred years ago with his cheesy gyroscopes, the notion that we couldn't replicate it today with high-end 21st century engineered gyroscopes, and also we have the advantage of motors, which will keep that gyro spinning continuously, and we still cannot duplicate it. That tells me that Foucault lied. It also tells me that if in our airplane, going back to my Cessna that I rented years ago when I was first getting my private pilot's license, that had a gyroscope in it that had to be calibrated on the ground. In other words, you cage the instrument while you are on the ground, and caging is simply nothing more than setting the azimuth into the gyroscope while it's calibrated on a level surface on the ground. And when you cage it, that's the last place that you calibrate your gyros. Once you take off, the gyros continuously run, and the only thing that you correct is heading due to magnetic declination. And this is something that's a routine practice for pilots. But the bottom line is that if there were any curvature at all, not only would the gyroscope detect it in an airplane, it would detect that ridiculous amount of curvature that I was talking about earlier, that you'd have to be compensating at the rate of 2,800 foot per minute in a standard jet airliner. But guess what? The gyroscope simply does not detect that. Why doesn't it detect it? Because there's no curvature to the Earth. End of story. There's so many things that prove this, and anybody that thinks that there is any modification going on to the gyroscopic mechanism itself that is modifying for the curvature of the Earth is deluded, and they simply have not done their homework and looked into these strange phenomena that everybody's touting called Schuler tuning, or the air discharge vanes at the bottom of the gyroscopic gimbal structure. Doesn't exist. Doesn't exist. Didn't exist 30 years ago when I got my pilot's license. You are never, ever trained to compensate for Coriolis, curvature of the Earth. You are never trained on the instruments. In fact, it is the very nature of the instruments to fight any sort of curvature or turning away from anything that is perfectly flat level. There are a million people that are going to come back with a million rebuttals to this, and I say bring them on, because whatever you bring back, I would suggest you really research it deeply. And then fine, if you find something that's great, present it to me. I will be happy to personally debate this with you, because for the last 3 weeks I've done nothing but research this, and I'm telling you that gyroscopes, contrary to the people in the chat that are claiming that they prove the ball Earth, do anything but that. They prove the flat Earth. Not only do they prove the flat Earth, but they prove the motionless flat Earth. So any comments, guys?
It's a possibility.
So what does this prove? This proves beyond any shadow of a doubt that both it is the ether rotating at approximately 15 degrees per hour around the Earth, and that there is zero motion of the Earth around the sun. Okay, so if you guys are understanding this, remember, everybody that is measuring this with their fiber optic gyros, they're looking at that 15 degrees per hour and say, yep, there it is. That proves that the Earth is rotating. But what they're completely failing to take into consideration is all the other motions that are in play here that are considerably faster than the 1,038 mile per hour rotation. For example, the 66,000 or 67,000 mile per hour velocity around the sun around the Milky Way around the Great Attractor. In other words, all of these things are well within the sensitivity thresholds of these ring laser gyros, and yet the only thing they measure is the 15 degrees per hour rotation. And that does change, by the way, by the latitude, and that's calculated by the cosine of the latitude times, oh shit, I forgot. Anyway, it's calculable, okay? But the bottom line is no other motion is detected. And that, of course, is the one thing that the mainstream and all these people saying, oh, well, these fiber optic gyros and these ring laser gyros are conclusively measuring the rotation of the Earth, wrong again. It is not what's happening, because there would be several other velocities in there that would heavily skew those readings because of the velocities involved being highly, well into the threshold of detectability of the ring laser gyro. So the conclusion of all this is that a lot of you remember Mark Sargent talking, reading the letter from the pilot that was talking about how the Adiro alignment calibration module unit had failed, and then he was told by air traffic control to essentially just go ahead and take off, and since he wasn't going out of radar range anywhere, that he could just check in and make manual adjustments manually. Well, to the pilot's surprise, there were never any adjustments to be made. It was always right on the money. And of course, the reason for that is because, again, it was not having to compensate for rotation of the Earth, but rather the heavens above. Therefore, it really didn't affect what was going on inside the cockpit. Now, that gets into a little bit more of a complex explanation, but and I will explain this at some point, but I think I've probably gone to my limit about people's attention span today. But all I wanted to do was point out that it is quite impossible that we would only be detecting one rotation of axis with the fiber optic or ring laser gyros when we have several other velocities going on. So that's it. Hopefully you guys understand it. If not, we'll try and elaborate on it more. But you know, it's conclusive, guys. Our own experiments tell us straight up that the ether is rotating around the Earth and that there is no tangential velocity around the sun. Period. End of story. Comments, you guys?
Let me close that for you.
In other words, whenever you have an electromagnetic rotation, you also have what's called a dielectric rotation. And the dielectric rotation is always at 90-degree perpendicular axis from every single point from the EM field itself. So you have this toroidal EM field, and no matter where you take a measurement or a sample of it, there will always be a 90-degree dielectric rotation. This is called counter space, okay? Now this is where, a lot of people have a hard time getting their head around this, and this is covered in electrical engineering, but it's basically this kind of, I guess you could look at it as kind of an alternate dimension, if you will, where the sun is actually drawing its energy from, is this counterspatial dielectric field. And remember what I told you guys about magnetic fields. All magnetic fields also have a dielectric component to them as well as an electrical component. We know that when a magnetic field cuts across a conductor, it induces a current flow of electricity. Conversely, there's also this dielectric field, which is the ether, which is the counterspatial force that's there. So we said, okay, so let's see if we can influence this alleged rotation of the Earth or the sky or whatever. And so we devised this experiment with this Helmholtz coil, with the idea being that if we can generate a magnetic field, we also know that that's going to affect the dielectric field as well. In fact, if we get enough power behind it and get it in close enough proximity, it will absolutely interfere with the dielectric or etheric field that the light itself is propagating through from the fiber optic gyro. So Rick built it, we hooked it up, fired it up, and lo and behold, as soon as we turned that Helmholtz coil on, the readings of 15 degrees per hour just went to heck. It just completely screwed with it. Well, that's a problem, because if we are able to affect it magnetically / dielectrically, then that tells us that it's not the motion of the Earth that's simply causing the phase change in the light, right? It's actually the dielectric field that we are influencing.
Let me close that for you.
Did the test, no precession, Rob Durham did this, in a multitude of ways. No procession. In other words, every time they cry about, oh, you didn't do this, or you did it wrong, or whatever, once again, they never, like Charles, oh, well, you just misunderstand it, or you did it wrong. When are you guys going to show us the right way to do it, where we're actually going to see these precession and these gyros? When are you going to show us your experiments instead of armchair quarterbacking? That's all you do. That's all you have, and name calling is all you have, and frankly, it gets a little old. That's why when we come out with these results that we're going to be hitting the universities directly and then the scientific community with these results. And, somebody somewhere is going to look at it and listen and go, oh my God, we're not appealing to the trolls. We already know what your function is. And we already know that either you are complete idiots or your cognitive dissonance is at such a high level that you'll never come out of the matrix, or you're simply being paid to try and debunk this. But you know what? Things like what I presented today are not debunkable. And not only that, it's been proven for over 100 years. And modern day technology is even proving more that there is no lateral motion around the sun, period. Yes, there is a rotational vector that's going around the Earth, but it is absolutely conclusively proven that it is coming from the heavens, the dielectric energy of the stars themselves, and not the Earth's rotation underneath them. So, I'm sorry to go on this rant, but, these trolls really piss me off sometimes because, all they can do is armchair quarterback, tell us what we do wrong, and never, ever do they provide any conclusive evidence to the contrary. All they can do is post links about what NASA says or what the mainstream says, and they act like they're big smarty pantses because they found this and they can, show it to us, like it means something. You know what, guys? Give it up. We're actually looking for our own truth, and we're doing it the best way we know how with the resources that we have. And, I'm sorry, but we're ripping you a new one. You're losing this battle, and it's about time you rid yourself of cognitive dissonance and start, smelling the coffee here.
How are you going to go into work tomorrow? How are you going to face the other science guys? How are you going to face yourself?
Okay, so let me break that down for you real quick. So inside the gyro system that he was talking about, the gyro system, in this case, the black box, was made by Honeywell. The alignment calibration module is not made by Honeywell. It's subcontracted out by another company, and that company has it sealed to where only they are allowed to work on it, but they don't ever work on it. They just swap them out. They just swap out the parts. So what happened was this particular alignment module broke before he could fly. The weird, on the weird circumstance, they couldn't get a new one in there, so he flew the 6 hours without using it. And the plane should have drifted because of the curvature and the Coriolis effect, otherwise known as the spinning of the Earth. And it didn't. The plane didn't drift for 6 hours. On a 777, that's a flagship, top of the line stuff there. Why didn't it drift? And he was trying to figure out why. He couldn't figure it out. And in the process of trying to figure out what happened, he discovered that this module, this module's made by exactly one company, and they supply every airline in the industry. And when you try to call them, they don't talk to you. And they're a subcontractor for NASA. Remember what I said about if you want to plug the holes, you want to do it very securely, when it comes to hiding things, and this would be that thing. So to keep the pilots from not worrying about it, you tell them there's a guidance system inside their plane that accounts for the curvature and the spinning of the Earth, and it doesn't. And you hope to God something like this doesn't happen, to where it breaks, and the pilot goes, well, wait a minute, how am I flying normally without that thing working? Why have that thing in there at all? And when you call the company to figure out what they're actually doing, they won't talk to you. That's brilliant.
To recap, if it is the telescope that is moving, then when it is filled with water, it has to be tipped further to see the star. If the telescope is stationary and the starlight drifting past us, then it does not have to be tipped further. In 1871, George Biddle Airy, the Astronomer Royal, performed this experiment. This is a copy from his original report. You can see that the two readings are virtually identical. If it had been the telescope that was moving, Airy expected a figure of 30 seconds of arc. In fact, he only managed to read 0.8 seconds of arc difference. Bradley first discovered stellar aberration, and it is interesting that in his report Airy mentions that it was now about 100 seconds of arc and that it was still slowly diminishing. This indicates that the speed of light was still decreasing in measurable amounts when Airy performed his experiment in 1871. Bradley first discovered stellar aberration, and it is interesting that in his report Airy, the result of Airy's experiment, known as Airy's failure, was that the telescope does not have to be tipped further. This proved that it was the incoming light that was moving past a stationary telescope fixed to the stationary Earth. What is interesting in his very brief report of only 4 pages is that not once did he refer to the astonishing results that the experiment proved. That the Earth was stationary. That the Earth was stationary. This experiment was also dismissed by Wikipedia, which said, "Ether drag test," under the main article, "Luminiferous Ether." By means of a water-filled telescope, Airy in 1871 looked for a change in stellar aberration through the refracting water due to an ether drag. Like in all other ether drift experiments, he obtained a negative result. This is a gross distortion of the truth. That he did not have to change the angle proved that it was the ether drifting past the stationary surface of the Earth.
Well, there you have it, everyone. Peer-reviewed, just what people want to see. So why is this ignored? Well, you know why this is ignored, because this definitely tells you that the Earth is not moving. In fact, no experiment ever has shown that the Earth moves.
Has there ever been an experiment done to prove that the Earth is revolving around the Sun?
Yes, there was several experiments in the 1800s. Dominique Arago, Armand Fuseau, Augustin Fresnel, but one of the most famous was the Michelson-Morley experiment in 1887.
Tell us about that.
Well, they used light beams to measure whether the Earth was moving, and they found that there was no movement. The Earth has to be moving 30 kilometers per second to complete its annual revolution, and they found out that it wasn't moving in a very precise. Michelson could have calculated it to 1/100th of what he got in his experiment. That's how sensitive his instruments were.
What did the experiment involve in terms of apparatus, so we can get a concrete understanding of
well,
what they
if the Earth is moving around the Sun, and we shoot that light beam in the direction that the Earth is moving, okay, and then we shoot another light beam perpendicular to that, well, the one that's in the direction of the Earth's movement should be impeded in some way if it's moving through space. Whereas this one is going perpendicular, would not be impeded.
Why not?
Because it's not going through space. It's just going north and south.
Okay.
Okay? And what they found, they expected to have a 30-kilometer difference between these two light beams. There was no difference. So the natural interpretation, and even Einstein admits this, Mach admits this, Born admits this, the natural interpretation is that the Earth isn't moving. So how do we get out of that? Well, you invent special relativity. And now you say, well, the reason that light beam wasn't affected when it went toward the motion of the Earth is because the apparatus shortened. Huh? Yeah, Michelson's apparatus shortened as it was going with the Earth in its orbit around the sun.
Wait, you're telling me that the contraction of mass was invented to explain away the results of the Michelson-Morley experiment?
Yes, and that's what my book will tell you, and it's been admitted by all the scientists.
Well, isn't there any experimental confirmation that as you approach the speed of light, there's a contraction effect? The impression is that there's all kinds of experimental confirmation.
That was invented. There's no proof to it.
Really?
Yes, all the physicists will tell you there's no proof
Not
to
that
it.
I'm surprised, you understand.
Yeah.
I know what the scientific community is capable of in terms of mass deception. Evolution is a mass deception. But I wasn't aware that they don't really have any even purported scientific confirmation in terms of physical measurement.
No, nobody
of the contraction effect.
Nobody measured a contraction. But they put it into a mathematical formula called the Lorentz transform, and it's probably the most famous equation used in physics today.
Does anyone expressly admit that, hey, we had to come up with this contraction effect because otherwise we're stuck with a motionless
Yes,
Earth?
the very guy who invented it.
Tell me what
Heinrich
he
Lorentz.
admitted.
Heinrich Lorentz says, I don't have any other explanation to this experiment of Michelson-Morley unless I contract the apparatus. Otherwise, we're going to have to believe the Earth is standing still in space.
Unbelievable.
Yeah.
Huh?
Yeah. Michelson's apparatus shortened.
Unbelievable.
Yeah.
Huh?
And you've never had issues, no matter where you're at, not calculating the Coriolis effect.
Never.
Huh?
But what they're completely failing to take into consideration is all the other motions that are in play here that are considerably faster.
Unbelievable.
Yeah.
Huh?
Yeah. Michelson's apparatus shortened.
In fact, no experiment ever has shown that the Earth moves.
Huh? Huh?
You can do it! You can do it! You can do it!
You can do it.
You can do it! You can do it! You can do it! You can